Hey everybody, welcome to the Cripescast. This week we are talking with Joel Brammeier. He is the president and CEO of the Alliance for the Great Lakes. It's a great organization that is all about the health and the wellness of the Great Lakes, which provides all of us with real nice looking at. You know, they're nice to look at. They're nice to swim in. They're nice to fish in. I'm a fan of all that sort of stuff. So it was just nice chit-chatting with Joel about what's going on with them now, especially as there's a new administration coming in and what that means for funding and what that means for just our health, our water quality, all that sort of stuff. So it was good chit-chat. And you guys know, if you've listened to this podcast, I am a huge hippie when it comes to the environmental stuff. Love fishing, love bird watching, love hunting, love all that, and love the things that we can do to help make that stuff better for everyone. Hunting too, yeah, the whole deal, you know. Anyways, good conversation with Joel. It was fun, and I hope you guys enjoy it. All right, let's get to my interview with Joel Brammeier. You got really nice hair.
I'm very thankful for that. It's my grandpa, who I'm hoping is where my hair came from, lived to either 102 or 104, and had basically a full head of hair till the day he died.
Shut up! Really?
So I'm keeping my hopes up.
That's impressive, man.
Yeah,
and that was before. Rogaine, that was before, well, I suppose he lived through Rogaine, but do you know if he was using Rogaine or Hims?
No, he never needed it. It just was genetic, and my dad is bald. He's got
Bummer.
He's got kind of the monk's ring around the back.
That's an underappreciated haircut these days.
I mean, it's not so much a haircut as it is a necessity. It's a genetic obligation for him, but he rocks it.
Well, I mean, look, he could, there's a lot of guys these days who don't go with the horseshoe. They go full bald.
Yeah.
But I feel like, sometimes I think you want the horseshoe especially in the Midwest. Hats don't cover that far down on your head. It's like a free scarf. Why would you get rid of it?
Just grow it out. There's something to be said for rocking what you got as opposed to, taking it all off. He's 86 now, so he's not his hairstyle isn't changing. But any chance of going for the full bald has passed him by. But
well, good. I like him embracing what he has, and then just letting everything else fly. Good for him. But enough about our hair and personal grooming. Why don't we dive into it? Yeah, and we may even include that in there. So actually, the way I want to kind of start these episodes out, we're kind of changing around the format of everything. But anyway, I just want to start out by asking you what makes you say cripes? Okay, now it's a cripe sesh. It's an open cripe sesh. It could be anything from, hair growth to what's going on in the Great Lakes on a regulation side. It could be anything. It could be a few things. But let's just start with one thing that makes you say cripes.
Well, I'll just be very current. My kids just turned 16. I have twins, and they are now wanting to learn how to drive and asking their mom and dad to help them get their permit hours and all that. And that is making me say cripes right now.
Yeah.
I live in Chicago, and it's a very kind of public transit, walking friendly, biking friendly city. I cycle a lot, and my dad role is with the kids. I'm like, you don't really need to learn how to drive right now, do you? And of course, they think the opposite. So that's one of those immediate cripes moments that's on my mind.
Are they twins? Why are they learning at the same time?
Yeah, they're twins. We have two. Those are our only two kids, and they were born at the same time. And so I got two potential drivers in a couple of years, two potential kids launching to whatever it is that they end up doing. It all kind of hits at once.
Yeah, don't you kind of wish that there were driverless cars at this point if you're letting your kids get behind the wheel?
In my lifetime, I hope that happens. Yeah, I'd love to have that. I think other cripes, man, I'm 50 and I get less and less fond of long stretches of cold as I get older. I grew up in the Midwest and so I'm used to it, but you get teased by these, sunny days, 60 degrees, you know, I even went down to the lake the other day and felt the cold breeze coming off the water, and then it goes back to snowing, and I just get that gets old in my bones as I get older. So that's been a cripes moment recently. And of course,
This
go ahead.
spring teas.
Yeah,
It's kind of
absolutely.
like strip teas, but not anything like that at all.
But cleaner, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, I like that. Spring teas. That's exactly what we're getting right now. And cripes, there's all sorts of cripes in the political and business world and all that stuff that's always going on. One of the things you have to do, I think, when you're working in environmental spaces is you've got to stay optimistic, right? You've got to recognize that the work that I do, stuff around water, whatever issue it is that animates you, there's just a lot of people with goodwill who want to get good things done, and you've got to try to stay optimistic even when you're in the middle of some of those cripes moments.
Yeah, so give our listeners like what a sense of what your role is and what you kind of do on a day in day out basis.
So I run a nonprofit organization called the Alliance for the Great Lakes, and our core role is we advocate for public policies and practices that protect the Great Lakes and clean water. And so, on any given day, I'm working with policy experts or researchers and scientists who might be experts in a particular issue. I also work with a whole team of people that make sure that we're getting good information out there about what's happening with the Great Lakes, and of course, part of my job is also raising the funds to support our work, and it's great. I have the fabulous privilege to work with a team of people who are here because they just love the lakes and love water, and we try to make sure that our cities and states and feds are doing right by the lakes and by clean water. That's the gist of it.
Yeah, I mean, and anyone who listens to this podcast know I'm like a big environmental hippie. I grew up being outside mostly. I just kind of fell in love with sort of the outdoors, and growing up near Milwaukee, there was obviously the Great Lakes. I would bike down to the lakefront and all of that, and it's just got a very nice place in sort of my childhood, even going through the rivers and fishing and all of that sort of stuff. Just so much is just in my heart when it comes to the Great Lakes. And I think sort of the big question right now is, what are the big things that are maybe threatening the Great Lakes? Let's start with that. What's threatening the Great Lakes, and then I want to get into like what you're excited about with the Great Lakes, what the positive stuff that's going on. But what's the biggest
Yeah.
threat to them right now?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Just back to your comment about growing up, I think there are so many people who, back to that sort of point about optimism, there's so many people who grew up with some connection to water around here that it's an easy and natural thing to draw on. I grew up about a mile from Lake St. Clair in Detroit, and just over and all sorts of Great Lakes and water experiences when I was younger too. And I don't know that any one thing pushed me in this direction, but as an adult, you look back on that and you realize, oh yeah, this is the anchor. This is what really, brought me to this, binds us together, and all that. Big challenges facing the Great Lakes. It's a huge region, right? And I always try to make sure people know before we start talking about the lakes. They've got the silhouette, the outline on the map is very well known, but it's like 1,000 miles across, and of course spans two countries, and so the issues facing any Great Lake or any particular place might be really different, from place to place, and I think that's critical to acknowledge, because you want to be able to serve all the needs that people have when they're talking about how they use the lakes. Big stuff that keeps me up. One is farming and agriculture. Has a huge impact on our clean water, and that's something that we work on a lot. I think about some of the businesses and growth in the area that's leading to larger water uses, like that, people who are practices that might take out multiple millions of gallons of water a day, and how that's growing, things like data centers and, different kinds of manufacturing. I think about, of course, I think about the role that our governments play in that and the importance of having leadership on clean water at a time like this. In just some of the everyday issues we deal with, invasive species, right? We've had, the Great Lakes have been kind of the global ground zero for critters coming in that aren't supposed to be here in fresh water, and it's caused all sorts of economic and environmental disruption. So I could go on and on, with the list, but all those things I just mentioned all have people working on the solutions too, which is great. But we've got no shortage of challenges here.
Yeah, and on this podcast, we've talked about the invasive species in the Great Lakes. We've talked about agriculture runoff in the Great Lakes and things farmers can do to help with that, and how. So we've touched on those two issues quite a bit. One thing that you mentioned that I don't think we have touched on really before is the data centers. So what do the data centers need water for?
So, well, the short answer is cooling, right? There's a lot of different ways that you can manage a data center, and this means when we talk about data centers, these are just places where data comes in and out, is being stored and managed for all sorts of uses. The needs for these things is booming with the advent of AI, kind of turbocharging the data needs. And so they create a lot of heat and they require cooling, right? And historically, if you grew up in the Great Lakes region, you saw all the big power plants, right? You saw these massive users of water, all that energy generation, steel manufacturing, auto production, all required like massive amounts of water, either coming out of a lake or a river or out of the ground. Some of those uses are still here, but now we're seeing these new forms of water users where they demand lots of water, either out of a lake, out of the ground, just for keeping servers cool. And the interesting thing about that is that it's certainly not a kind of one size fits all industry. There are a lot of ways that they can be managed that don't require a lot of water use, which is good. But we're right at the beginning of seeing how this is affecting, how water gets used here in the Great Lakes.
Okay, if I'm thinking back to like science class, that water it evaporates and then it comes back through the water cycle. I guess with these data centers using this water, are they A, polluting it, or B, is there a lot of water loss from them using it?
Yeah, no, well, the answer is yes and no. You can do it in a way that causes pollution. You can also do it in a way that doesn't, right? So part of the challenge is because it's so new, we don't necessarily have the right practices and standards in place to make sure that the bad things don't happen. You talk about evaporation, and the Great Lakes and all the water, right? Of course, the Great Lakes are the big basins you can see, but all the water in the Midwest in the Great Lakes Basin, whether it falls into an inland lake or a river or the ground, eventually it finds its way into a Great Lake. So if it evaporates here, we see recharge of that water from, rainfall and other sources, right? It's all that, like you said in science class, it's all part of that water cycle, right? The biggest things that drive water availability here are evaporation and precipitation, right? Rainfall and evaporation. So, we don't right now see a lot of huge water loss from cooling, here in the Great Lakes. But we also don't know a lot about what's coming our way, and we aren't really prepared to make smart decisions about how much of this large water use to permit, where to permit it, where it makes most sense for the ecosystem and all that. Governments are still just at the beginning of trying to figure this stuff out.
And it seems right now like the federal government is very anti any sort of regulation. Does that mean that as it pertains to the Great Lakes, AI data centers will have sort of free reign to do whatever they want with the water? Or does something like the Great Lakes Compact potentially stand in the way of making sure there's some guardrails around it?
Yeah, water is one of those things that the states actually have a lot more authority over than the federal government. And I think that's where a lot of the debate and maybe fight's going to be over the next few years. You've kind of seen some rumblings in DC about, oh, we should have a national water policy, or we should somehow, get rid of some of these agreements. And I think for the Great Lakes states guard that their control of the water supply pretty jealously. And so that'll continue. I think that you mentioned the compact. One of the things, believe it or not, 20 years ago in the Great Lakes, there was very little transparency around who was using water, how much they were using, and in some cases, you could use water without even getting a permit, right? And you think about the American West and some of the challenges that they're having, whether it's filling swimming pools or growing almonds or whatever it is. The idea that you could somehow just take water and use it and not tell anybody and nobody knows what's going on seems kind of ridiculous, because all this stuff is very well controlled out west. But the Great Lakes, because we've got this abundant water, right? The stat everybody knows, 20% of the world's fresh surface water. A lot of times, people have just kind of used it and not thought about how much they were using. Well, in about 20 years ago with the compact is a policy that prevents water from being diverted out of the Great Lakes, but it also requires the states and the provinces in Canada individually to set up water withdrawal monitoring and permitting programs, right? So every state has to kind of meet a common baseline of understanding how water is being used, where it's going, who's got the permits to use it, and then continually, hopefully, improve those programs over time. And so we're starting, the region's starting to catch up and starting to get a better handle on who's using what water and how much and all that stuff. But we've got a ways to go. So the compact doesn't prevent these kinds of water uses, and it doesn't. In an ideal world, it should bring more transparency, to who's using the water, how it's being used, and how it's being, circulated back into the Great Lakes.
Yeah, yeah. And on that circulate back into the Great Lakes, one last question on those AI data centers, since they are going, I think I saw some projections. It's the usage of energy, and these data centers are being built out at just an exponential rate, maybe tripling just in the next few years. What's the byproduct? They use the water, they put the water back into the water system. What is the pollution that can be associated with that? And how is it possible to limit that pollution?
So one thing that a lot of people don't necessarily think of as pollution, but it is heat. So when we talk about thermal pollution, when you use water for cooling anything, right, the water heats up, it takes the heat from whatever you're trying to cool. That heat's got to go somewhere. Energy can't be created or destroyed. So it moves with the water, and eventually it gets dumped back into a surface water. And so when we talk about thermal pollution, it's limiting the temperature change that cooling water can cause when it's brought back into the surface water. Chemical pollution is when you have additions of chemicals to the cooling water that are used maybe in a recirculating system, right? So some of these facilities have cooling that uses chemical cooling, and it recirculates over and over, and uses chemical reactions to cool instead of large quantities of water. That can be good in the sense that if it's a truly closed system, right, you're not discharging any of that pollution. But there's always leakage, and in some cases, you are eventually going to be discharging, some of that polluted water, back to a surface water. And this is where we get into things like the Clean Water Act and permits, and it's important to recognize that in some ways, every business, every home pollutes in some way, right? There's a certain level that you are allowed to pollute in order for us to just be able to live as human beings, right? And so if it's permitted, that means you can put limits on that pollution. You can share data that shows whether or not you're complying with those limits. And the whole idea is to keep the surface water, the ecosystem healthy, keep it safe for people to be able to use again. But that's, again, we're getting into sort of uncharted water with all of these facilities and all the different ways that they approach this challenge.
Yeah, and serve as the technology exponentially advances, probably the new new methods of doing it are going to be introduced probably before they can get a chance to be regulated. So something, I guess, to just keep an eye on.
Yeah,
What
they're not waiting. They're definitely not waiting around for us to figure out how to protect our water. So that's something that's moving fast.
Well, it's great that you guys are there to sort of just keep an eye on all that and make sure that it's not just a few people who benefit from the water, but it's sort of everybody who benefits from the water, and also doesn't get sick by it, doesn't destroy the ecosystem. What are some other things that you're kind of focused on? We did discuss microplastics in a different episode, but how big of an issue is that as it pertains to the Great Lakes?
Well, it's huge as it is globally, right? So unfortunately, the Great Lakes are experiencing that same plastics challenge as everybody else. It's a little bit different here than I think in other parts of the world. The main reason is because we drink the water, right? So when you think about ocean plastic pollution, obviously you're most of the time you're not drinking ocean water unless you're desalinating, and then it's a whole process. For us, we're taking that water in every day. So water we drink is actually, frighteningly a source of microplastics into our bodies because, drinking water treatment doesn't remove all those microplastics. So that's one big difference for the Great Lakes. And then, another is that, we have less of that like big plastic here in the Great Lakes. You've got the images you might think of fishing nets and big rafts of floating bottles, or rivers in Southeast Asia that are sort of teeming with plastic, like large plastic waste. Almost everything you see here in the Great Lakes is microplastics, right? So really tiny particles that have gotten into the water from a whole variety of sources. I think the thing about the drinking water reality, and the fact that also those plastics then show up in anything that's manufactured using Great Lakes water, right? So we don't just drink it; it's used for making beer, canning vegetables, and other things. Any manufactured product that requires a water supply from the Great Lakes is getting microplastics from the Great Lakes. And I think that's been a wake-up call for the states and the people who live here in a way that's, I think, a bit different than it is globally. And so you're starting to see the states thinking through how can we be on the front line of trying to reduce the sources of plastic pollution in a way that, candidly, I don't think our federal government or Congress is going to be able to do soon. And so, the states are really in an interesting position right now because, this issue has captured people's attention in a way that a lot of environmental issues don't, because it's just kind of gross, right? You got plastic in your water, plastic in your beer. It's there. It's going in there every day. It's going into you. And that kind of triggers, more action, right? Than a lot of other environmental issues, because it just doesn't feel right to people. So yeah, the states are thinking of different ways to approach this legislatively and working with companies and all that, which is good. It's a big, as you know, Charlie, it's a huge global challenge, and it's not like one Great Lakes state can solve it, but I think working together and really rallying around, keeping our drinking water free of plastic can be a way that our Great Lakes, the Midwest, kind of takes a leadership role on this.
Yeah, and I think the microplastics is a really interesting issue because it kind of brings both the left and the right together. A lot of times people on the right don't want to be controlled by the government, but I think a lot of people on the right are starting to see, especially with this microplastics issue, that they're being controlled by big business because they are just creating the plastic, allowing it to degrade, not taking responsibility for it, and therefore effectively putting all this microplastic in our body to the point where we all have it in our blood, our lungs, our brain. So it's just kind of like that idea of a larger entity controlling us, whether that be controlling our health or controlling our businesses. People don't like that. So I think the microplastics issue is very much so one that unites people on both ends of the political spectrum, of not wanting to be forced to ingest something, whatever that thing is, especially if it's so unnatural.
Yeah, I hope so. I think you're onto something. And, it's, when we think about, first of all, I don't think regulation is a dirty word. You can call it protection or, whatever it is, right? Regulation is part of the reason our water is as clean. It's a huge part of why our water is as clean as it is, right? You go back to pre-regulation days in the 60s and you can see pictures of what the Great Lakes look like, right? It's pretty clear. But they've got to be smart and they've got to be regulations that protect the consumer. With plastics, I think about sometimes a source of pollution, it becomes so, kind of ubiquitous in our lives that you're just never going to be able to control it or take personal responsibility for it on your own, right? And I think that's where we are with plastics, right? It's everywhere. It's in so many things that we rely on, that we have to use, and it's in a lot of things that we choose to use, right? And so we can take personal responsibility for not using as much plastic, which I encourage everybody to do, right? But you can't avoid it. You can't. It is literally everywhere in our lives, and that's the point where I think it's rational to talk about regulation, to say we've got to have producers taking responsibility for this stuff, just like we have for a lot of other pollutants over history, to keep us safe, to keep our natural resources safe. That's where we are with plastic right now. And I actually think that there are a number of, folks in the industry, companies that understand this. That, you've even seen, the chair of SC Johnson, calling for regulation, calling for federal regulation, because he sees that you need certainty. We need to know how we're going to confront this problem and solve it together. And part of that has to be getting clear about the regulations that are needed to reduce how much plastic companies are producing. So that it's encouraging. It's still a slow road, but that's encouraging to see. And I think you're right that those voices are coming from all kind of across the political spectrum.
Yeah, and you say that some people view regulation as a dirty word, and that's very, very, very true. But what does it was a Republican president. It was Richard Nixon who put in the Clean Endangered Species Act. I think the Clean Water Act. I'm not totally sure. Was it him or someone else? Do you know?
Well, yeah, that was signed in 72. I'm some of that stuff was passed with a congressional veto override, but I can't remember which is which. But you're in the right era.
Yeah, yeah, but but give us a sense of, because that was so long ago. I think people forget. You said that obviously back in the 60s, things were not good as it pertained to our water. A lot of people don't know that. A lot of people don't know the history, or but give people a sense of what our rivers looked like before there was regulation in this political moment when so much regulation is being slashed. What did it look like before this clean water regulation?
Yeah, I missed the beginning of the Clean Water Act movement, right? Because I'm not old enough to have been there. So I'm relying on.
I'm not saying you were old enough. Look at that. Look at all the pepper in that hair right now. I mean, come on.
You're not. I've heard that several times recently. I don't know if these last couple of months have made me more gray or what, but it's.
I'm trying to compliment you. Yeah, it looks good.
I say that because one part of it though is I want to respect my ancestors, the ones who actually started this work. There were some great folks who were there at the beginning when all that was getting started, including the founder of my organization, a woman named Lee Botts, who's from Northwest Indiana. And I mentioned that because Northwest Indiana is one of those places where you really saw the evidence of what it was like beforehand. And I've only seen this in pictures, but we've got oil refinery, lots of steel mills, chemical manufacturing in that area, and there's pictures of like rivers with just orange foam, scum, thick mats of it, chemicals basically floating on the surface of rivers, right? And so you're looking at something that looks like it ought to be in a lab or in a toxic waste barrel, and it is literally just running down a river, right? And I've seen many, many pictures like that of unregulated pollution. Cities where you could effectively, just discharge sanitary waste, right? So sewage into the lakes, into rivers, because it was seen as well, we don't like to do this, but we don't really have any other choice because we've got so much of it to get rid of. So we're just going to dump it, right? And these are I mean, and of course, the rivers catching on fire, the Cuyahoga being not the first or the last river to catch on fire, but the one that got famous. And again, it's sort of like with the plastics issue. It's maybe a little easier to get to focus people on, oh, we actually do need laws. We actually do need regulations when you're seeing this physical evidence of how bad things can get right in front of you. So a lot of that is what led to the political moment that allowed the Clean Water Act to pass, and a lot of other environmental regulations around that same time. And a lot of that did come from the Great Lakes region. Of course, I got to be remiss if I didn't mention, Rachel Carson in Western New York, with Silent Spring and the Love Canal. And so, unfortunately, right, when you clean up all that really bad stuff, you end up with lakes and rivers and inland lakes that a lot of the time look really great, right? Fortunately, they are a lot healthier than they were 50 years ago. But now we've got some of these pollution challenges that can be under the radar, like, microplastics that you can't see, that it can be harder to get, the attention than, say, something that's so dramatic, like, these lakes and rivers that you can walk up to and smell and know that something very, very wrong is happening. And we don't have as much of that as we did back in the 60s and early 70s.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Because as soon as it turns to something you can't visually see, you're relying on people who have done research on it and science. And two things happen. One is people trust science less, people trust experts less these days. And two, there's a playbook that the tobacco industry that the big oil and big gas industries have used, and that's to muddle. First of all, not to reject science, but to embrace it and say we're Ted Cruz does this a lot. He says, we are never the science is never settled, on a lot of these issues. And it's like they fund these organizations, they fund a lot of studies to then sort of allow what the result they want to get out there. So basically you can confuse people and you can put so much other science into the thing that people can say, well, maybe it's not that bad, or you can just delay it long enough so you can make the money and then kind of deal with it down the road if it ever gets to that. In the meantime, lobbying to make sure these regulations don't get put into place. So that's kind of the sad danger in what you're saying, not being able to visually see the problem. Have you encountered any sort of like good ways of sort of conveying those messages to people, or seen a lot of hope for people sort of understanding the reality of these situations recently?
Well, yeah, I do think that, so one, I think it's hard. I get it. Like people, it's hard for us to grapple with uncertainty, right? It's like we've all got a lot going on in our lives, and it can be tough. Science is about uncertainty, right? It's about trying to, study and observe, and as you go, you try to eliminate as much uncertainty as possible. But along the way, you ask a lot of questions. And I think one of the good things we've got here in the Midwest is a network of some of the best universities in the world. And I just want to mention that because it is, I know from looking at, people's responses to polls and just my own work over the last 30 years, that our scientists at our public, academic institutions here in the Midwest are some of the most trusted voices on issues like Great Lakes water pollution and a whole lot of other things. And so I just, I want to stress that, because one of the best things we can do is support our universities who are really on the front lines of cutting edge environmental research here in the Midwest. I think that we are seeing with the plastics issue, I can talk to a scientist. We've got a partnership, for example, with Rush University, which is one of the big medical campuses here in Chicago. And I can go to them and I can get slides that show how plastic particles look in human tissue, right? And it's pretty striking, right? So I can go to somebody and say, hey, this is what it looks like when you find bits of plastic moving through your organs, moving through your bloodstream, in your brain. And it's, of course, horrifying and fascinating, right? So I think if we can find the ways to show people how this stuff shows up in a way that's directly relevant to their health, and it's backed by sound science and good data, that makes a real impact, right? Um, I think people got, just to bring in another issue, where I've seen the sort of the visible evidence lead to change, right? When you had the Flint water crisis that sort of started, it started a while ago, but it sort of came to a head in 2015, and you had real people being harmed in a very unfair way, children being harmed, for life. And you could connect that to, like, this is what's in the ground, this is the pipe, this is the people, this is the health, this is the impact that's being caused. That kind of drawing those kinds of connections, I think, really helps people understand that they have the ability to make improvements, right, through their own action, but also through government action and through spending money wisely to knock out some of these pollution problems. So I do think it's on us, right? Like, people don't necessarily have time in their days to go around and, like, find all the ways to connect the plastic you're drinking to that, slide of a human liver that shows how it's then showing, embedding itself in your body. And that's one of the things that, we and others can do, is to show that how those connections are happening in the environment into yourself. And I think, Charlie, I think that's often what sparks action and what gets people to say, okay, I'm going to spend time on this. I'm going to not be afraid to talk about maybe regulation. Maybe it's going to cost a bit more, but we're going to do this because we only have, one source of water, and we've got to protect it.
Well, that's great. I mean, can we do that right now? Do you have these slides, maybe not readily available, but you can send them to us later?
Yeah, I'd have to find, like, dig all that stuff up and schedule it with you, because I don't really have it at my fingertips. So I'll tell you how this all came about. It's maybe
Yeah.
this interesting. So we're chatting with one of our supporters, and who also supports Rush. We were chatting, and it came about that they've got this. Their concern on this is actually with plastic implants, right? So they do hip replacements, joint replacements, and what they find is that they are those which are made of plastic, and they're actually shedding, plastic particles into the body, right? And so they're very concerned about tracking how this stuff moves through the body. And so we were chatting, and we're like, yeah, we're concerned about how this stuff moves through the body too, but for different reasons, from different sources. So they've got this different motivation for looking at how this stuff moves, because obviously you don't want plastic that's put in your body to help, like a joint replacement, to also be causing problems as it moves into all these tissues and potentially even into the brain. So I have a picture here of this, like, tray of joints that they were showing about, and how they worked. But I'll find that presentation, the actual slides showing the how they're tracking plastics, and I can do something with that with you.
Yeah, no, that would be great. That's very interesting. I mean, because you do read the studies, and there is, I believe, the study that I read recently said that every human body has plastic in the blood, in the lungs, in the brain. Fellas got it in their balls. It's all over the place. So it would be really interesting to see how it moves through the tissues, and then it's hard to imagine that won't have consequences. The science is not settled on it, but a lot of folks have suggested that it's one of the things contributing to colon cancer being attributed to younger and younger people. So, it's just very interesting, and something that I think the more we can connect it with people, and the more you can visually connect it, kind of in the way, the rivers aren't on fire anymore, but something else is happening. So
yeah, it's almost like that issue too. It's almost like a loop people, it's like we want things that we can control, right? We want to be able to do something about the problem and then know that we found a solution. And the microplastics thing in the Great Lakes, it's almost a loop in some ways because you see the highest concentrations of these things near the biggest cities, right? Because
Hmm.
it's coming from people, it's coming from wastewater. And and so what that means too, though, is you can, if you work on reducing the sources locally, right? And like, so let's say a state decides it's going to really make an effort to reduce the amount that's being manufactured, disposed, et cetera. You'll see that the improvements also happen locally. The water you're coming through your intakes back to your community is then has less plastic in it. And so you can almost see this kind of virtuous circle emerging where, yeah, it's a big global problem and it's a big 1,000-mile wide Great Lakes problem, but you can actually see an impact if you control it locally. You can see the impact locally, and it's going to affect the actual water that you're drinking, and that's kind of feeding the businesses in your community. And that to me is a really inspiring way to approach this, and gives me hope that we're going to be able to confront this problem.
Yeah, and you guys also do things like beach cleanups and you organize things like that, don't you? Which I think, though small in the grand scale of the plastic, you obviously want to cut it off at the source. I think when you do a beach cleanup, you kind of realize quickly how much different plastic there is, how many just bottle caps you come across, like those plastic bottle caps, how many little small pieces of plastic there are just washing up on the beaches, big things, small things. And then you walk the beach and the beach looks relatively clean, but as you walk it, you easily fill up bag after bag after bag of just plastic, you know?
Yeah, it is remarkable. We hear that all the time, exactly what you just said. I don't know why I'm here because this beach is already clean. And then you just spend a minute staring at, underneath your feet and you realize, oh, actually, it's not. And that gives you a sense of the scale of the microplastics problem. About give or take, for the last 2 decades, about 86% of what we pick up, our volunteers have picked up over thousands and thousands of beach cleanups has been plastic. So 86% of that debris is plastic, just to kind of put a point on how prevalent it is. That going back to your comments earlier about the right and the left coming together, which is kind of hard to find these days. One of the things we put a premium on is getting people involved in protecting the Great Lakes. And I think that things like beach cleanups, like you said, they're small steps. But they kind of open up a great vision of what's going on with our water, with our ecosystems. And it's a way that people can connect to the resource and understand why a lot of the things we've been talking about are important to support. So yeah, I always encourage people volunteer with us, but volunteer period, right? Get involved. There's great water groups all over the Great Lakes region, in every community. Go out and participate in that work, see what's going on, kind of touch the water with your hands, see what's in it. And I also just tell people, just use it, get out there, swim, whatever you do, boat, canoe, fish. Like, using our water is a form of advocacy, right? Because you're declaring, hey, this is important to me, my family and friends. It's important to the place I live, just by being in it, just by being wet, right? You're becoming an advocate. And I think that's one of the great things about living in this part of the world.
It's very cool, and for a lot, it's a good thing for the environmentalists to do, but also the hunters. If you look at Ducks Unlimited, they do a lot of things like water, wetland restoration, and because if you want to keep hunting a sustainable thing, you gotta keep the environment able to sustain the ducks, as simple as that. So there's so many groups like that that have many different reasons for wanting to keep our Great Lakes great. One question we've seen all these cuts in the federal government, like the EPA shutting down environmental justice offices, for instance, and the terminations and the funding cuts. How is that? How are those federal cuts affecting you guys right now?
Yeah, well, directly, we are almost 100% privately funded here at the Alliance, and so it's not a direct issue for our organization, which is probably the least important thing right now. The most important thing is that we're seeing cuts that remove scientific capacity, remove capability from agencies that are charged with protecting the Great Lakes, like EPA. Another one that's less of a household name, but the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration or it's called NOAA, is responsible for things like climate research, algae bloom research, which is a huge problem in Green Bay and in Lake Erie. Blooms that actually are sometimes toxic and can be really harmful to people. So predicting those blooms is another part of what NOAA does. You're seeing cuts to the Fish and Wildlife Service on issues like sea lamprey control. Sea lampreys are this invasive species that have been here for a long time, but they have to be controlled every year in rivers across the northern part of the region. And federal staff are the ones who are out there doing those controls, right? And so, these cuts that are, in my take, indiscriminate and really don't have anything to do with the importance of the work are happening. So I'm really concerned about that. I mean, I think that there are, it's always, if you want to have an objective review of a federal program and make some choices about how to change it, yeah, go for it, right? But that's not what's happening right now. This is cutting for cut's sake. And unfortunately, I think there's a lot more to come. We've seen announcements, again, vague, but talking about 65% plus cuts to US EPA. And I just want to stress, we're not here to defend the status quo. We're here to defend the Great Lakes, right? And so when these federal agencies, what they provide is scientific leadership to make sure that the Great Lakes are being restored, that money's being spent in a smart way, and also that regulations are being administered so our water stays protected, right? These federal agencies are kind of the backstop to make sure that federal law gets followed, and industries and cities and lots of other sources of pollution don't break the rules. And as we talked about earlier, Charlie, we've seen the benefit of that over the last 50 years, right? That happens because there's somebody at the tiller is actually paying attention to where the boat is going, right? And if you don't have that, which I'm afraid we're making cuts that are going to eventually put our backs against the wall on this. You're eventually going to see impacts on our clean water, and I hope that our Great Lakes members of Congress, who, again, this region is so focused on clean water in a way that some other parts of the country aren't. I'm hopeful that our representatives in Congress understand just how important the Great Lakes and clean water are to people here, and that they see the value of standing up for a lot of these programs. So yeah, it's tough to understand why some of these indiscriminate cuts are being made, and we've got a lot of work to do to make sure that we don't kind of fall back to bad times and start seeing some of the impacts actually in the water of that loss of leadership.
Yeah, I mean, because we saw before the Clean Water Act, before all these things that happened in the 70s, we visually saw what happened when you let industry be left to its own devices. A lot of times you follow the next quarter, or you're following the stock market. You're trying to make as much money for your investors. You're not concerned about what you're doing to the water. If that's your main objective, is what's best for investors, that's what leads to water setting on fire, which is kind of crazy because the cost of water is, for all of us, it's the thing we need the most, and yet it's the thing that we are just cutting the regulation of making sure that it's safe for all of us, which is frustrating.
I mean, and I get, businesses need to do business. Businesses need to employ people, right? I get that, but there's really kind of three. It's almost a three-legged stool of clean water protection, right? You've got voluntary action, things that people and companies might do for a variety of reasons, right? To improve things. You got spending. You've got to spend money to clean things up and to make things better, to fix water infrastructure. All that stuff costs money. And then the third is regulation, right? Because we're not going to get there out of the goodness of all of our hearts, right? We've got to have smart science and smart regulation that sets the limits on what's allowed and drives us to meet those limits. And if any of those three things goes away, our clean water is going to suffer. Our Great Lakes are going to suffer, right? And so I think that, again, the encouraging thing I see right now is I don't think that there's a lot of support for undoing like that federal environmental leadership on water in the Great Lakes region. Like I mean, I talk to, as I'm sure you do, a lot of people about environmental issues across the region all the time. And there is for sure, a bipartisan core here in the Great Lakes that is very supportive of smart environmental regulation, smart water regulation, in addition to being supportive of spending and voluntary action. So I think that what we're seeing from the White House right now is not in step with kind of the approach that the Midwest states have taken over the last 50 years. And I don't want to speculate too much on where things are going from here, but I am going to say that it's really critical for the Great Lakes states and our partners, the Canadian provinces, to be stepping up and being good, solid champions, for the Great Lakes as we are in a really turbulent time.
Yeah. And I agree with you. Nobody wants to make business harder. You want a strong economy, you want people to do that, but if making a strong business, if we are the ones footing the bill for that, by now the water's a mess and now we have to pay billions of dollars to clean it up, then did that business really make any money at the end of the day? Or did they just make money and take their money and now we have to pay perhaps more money because they made a certain amount of money? That's what has never made sense to me. Being controlled by a business like that is just, that's one of the frustrating things.
Yeah, that's what, there's this thing called, not to get too policy wonky, but there's this thing called extended producer responsibility. And it's a very live conversation in that plastics issue, because it's all about, hey, if you manufacture something that everybody needs and everybody uses, you're not going to like foist off the cost of disposal on society at large, right? We're going to have to incorporate that into the business, right? So how do we regulate it? How do we pay for it? How do we reduce the sources, right? Make that part of the business model. And again, that some of that can happen with, smart, good companies doing it voluntarily, but a lot of it has to happen with rules of the game, regulations that are fair and lift up everybody, right? And I think that's just got to be part of how we do business in the Great Lakes and everywhere. But certainly, it's coming. That approach, I think, is really live in grappling with the plastics issue.
Yeah. And just a little bit larger of on a larger scale, what role do the Great Lakes play and the Midwest play as it pertains to climate change? Like, how are the Great Lakes sort of helping important with sort of the changes we're seeing in the climate?
Well, the lakes are certainly like sentinels of climate change. I think anybody who's lived here for, I was going to say multiple generations, but it doesn't even take that long, right? To notice the things like algae blooming in Lake Superior, right? One of the coldest lakes, or the coldest lake, is now experiencing regular seasonal toxic algae blooms, especially in the western end, which is scary. Lake Superior is one of the fastest warming freshwater lakes in the world. Farmers, will tell you, I hate to generalize and I don't want like speaking for people, but I am very aware of how aware, the agriculture sector is of changing precipitation patterns, changing patterns of water availability, all of which are linked to global climate changes, right? And so there's a keen awareness among that part of the economy and that part of the water world that something strange is afoot. You're seeing these much more dramatic, sort of fast changes in Great Lakes water levels than we used to see, right? Going from a record low to a record high in 7 years. So the one role the Great Lakes play is as a sentinel. It shows us that something globally is shifting, right? We're also a contributor, right? We've spent a lot of our decades generating electricity from coal, right? That's starting to change, right? Which is great, and we're becoming more and more reliant on renewable energies and other sources here. Um, I think the way that the Great Lakes region, in addition to just being a place where through energy generation and through our prevalence in the auto industry, we can obviously play a global role in reducing carbon emissions. We also need to play a role in adapting to the realities of climate change on the ground. Unfortunately, the impacts of climate change in the Great Lakes are kind of baked in for the next century, right? We can't stop the damage that's already been done and then the effects that that's going to have on our waters. What we can do is be honest about those impacts, right? And show that we know that the next century of how rainfall happens, right, or storms happen, and how lake levels change is going to look a lot different from the previous several centuries, right? And so we can be honest about that, and we can incorporate new data into how we plan and how we make business decisions, and how we regulate water, which is how I hope things go. Or we can act like none of that stuff exists and then wonder what happened when our we parts of the region actually end up being water scarce, even though we're in a water abundant region. Or our Green Bay and Western Lake Erie keep getting more and more foul instead of actually getting cleaned up. So the consequences of not acknowledging the reality of a changing climate are that the problems that we're dealing with right now are just going to get worse and worse. And so I think that's a place where the Great Lakes region can play a leadership role, is, be thankful for the abundance of water we've got. And then, be honest about the impacts that climate change is happening, and show the world that we can do a better job of confronting this challenge, and acknowledging living in a climate realistic way. Yeah, those are just, I guess, some thoughts on how we can take a leadership role in a way that, again, is something that we can control part of that destiny as water leaders, for the globe.
Yeah, I think honesty is a huge thing. When people just say, "Oh, climate change, it doesn't exist," or whatever, it's just a very disingenuous. It's just not true. It's not true at this point. You can look around the world and see it's not true. And so, yeah, to just at least have the conversation of it doesn't mean everything gets regulated and you can't do business or whatever, but it's like just having the conversation. What's the smartest thing to do? Because at the end of the day, we, the people, are the ones paying the bills for it. We are accepting the consequences for it. So you might as well have a say and not just deny it's happening.
I mean, that's right. We spend even, people think about damage from climate change, and they think about the ocean coasts, of course, and hurricanes and this kind of thing. There are hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars going to the Great Lakes states for dealing with flood damage, for dealing with coastal erosion. Money not just coming from the federal government, but that's being spent by state and local governments, being spent by, by private citizens, right, who might have a waterfront property, right, and they need to do something about that. So the amount of money that goes into kind of trying to armor ourselves away from climate change, or trying to restore damage that's been done, is immense. And some of that money, some of that time could be better spent on, acknowledging the problem and planning for like a longer term adaptation to some of those challenges. And also, again, I just think as a historically, I'm a water person, not an energy person, but as a historically kind of carbon intense part of the world, between the Great Lakes states and the Canadian provinces, we have a great opportunity to stand up together and say, we are going to change, we are changing how we do business, and we're going to be part of the solution. And, some places in this region are already doing that, some not so much, but it's a great opportunity for the Great Lakes.
Well, this has been really nice having you on. Before I let you go, is there any thing that you think we didn't touch on that you'd like to chit chat about?
We talked about a lot. I know you've got a lot of material here, Charlie. Appreciate you listening. This is personal. I'll just tell you. I didn't, the way I heard about you first a couple of years ago was the bit you did on Hudson, Ohio. I don't know if you
Oh,
remember.
yeah. The ice fishing.
Yeah, the ice fishing. My wife grew up there.
Oh, really?
And so, yeah, I told her I'd try to work that in when I talked to you. So here I am doing it. She got a real kick out of that. So,
did she know the mayor who was very concerned about prostitution during ice fishing?
she did not, but I will say, I think she would say that tracks with
Yeah.
kind of the culture of the town. So she grew up there in the what would it have been? The 80s. I think she moved to Wisconsin in 89 maybe. So that, her formative years were in Hudson. But that's how I first heard about you, and have been a follower and fan ever since.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm glad ice fishing prostitution could bring us together in this
Yeah,
moment.
I never would have predicted that one.
Well, Joel, thanks. This has been really cool. And if people want to get involved, help you out either via donations or time, how can they reach out?
Yeah, so we're easy to find. Our website's greatlakes.org, greatlakes.org, and you can sign up as a volunteer. You can do a beach cleanup. You can join our ambassadors program, where we actually provide like deep training and education on Great Lakes issues. If you want to support us financially, always appreciated. And lots of ways to get involved as an advocate for Great Lakes protection. So greatlakes.org, and we'd love to have you.
Awesome. Thanks, Joel. Really appreciate your time, man. Tell your wife I say hi, too.
I will, Charlie. Thank you.
All right, folks. Well, that's it for this week. Thanks to Joel for coming on. Make sure you check out at Alliance for Great Lakes. That's Alliance, the number 4, and then Great Lakes. You can find them on Instagram, Facebook, Blue Ski, the X, the whole deal. And also, there's a nice op-ed from Joel published on Thursday in the Chicago Sun-Times. And we will link that in the show notes. So thank you all for listening. Everyone, keep her moving, watch for deer, and we will see you next week.
So roll out the barrel and get the band brewing. Life's got you down, just keep her moving.